All right, so guys, here's our challenge really. I'm going to try and just pull up a picture that is kind of indicative of what we're trying to do here, I guess. Um, uh, something like this, right? So a very simple kind of facade would basically just have punched openings, windows and particular configurations. For us, we're starting off very simple, so we're not going to have a lot of variation. So what we are doing is essentially taking the surface of a mass building, right? It's super simple. It's just a box. We're going to panelize it so that we have, a datum or a set of data that we would then reduce the size of that panel and then subtract it. Beginning to make sense now? How the two relate? So if you think about what we just did, right? We have a reference surface, which is this. Then we have a subdivision, which is this and that. And then we have the actual reduction of that data, right? So that it's not the full size and we're not just going to delete the whole surface, but we have a reduction of each of those panels that we can use as a reference for subtraction. So did you learn subtraction yet on the Rhino side of this class? No? Okay. All right, so I can do a quick Rhino tutorial when we get to it, but let's get there first and then I'll show you that one. Whoops. So to begin our operation, right, let's assume that this particular surface is the full surface that we want, right? So that is the front of our building for all intents purposes. If I turn this back on, what you see, let me turn this one off, what you see is a subdivision. And I'm going to keep it simple with some very small numbers here at first. So I'm going to go down to, say, 5 subdivisions that way, and maybe 4 subdivisions this way. So that gives us a subdivided surface for each of those. Now, here's what you need to know. Okay, when it pushes that information out, right, it cuts it up into little bits and pieces, but now it's created 20 individual surfaces. So if you look at what we have here, if I want to create a reduction of each of those panels, what I have to do is replace the one surface that is being fed with every single one of these surfaces that we've created. Does that make sense? You just plug it in. It's plug and play. So all I have to do now is just grab this subdivide and drop it down into this subdivide. And it's going to, oh, it's hidden. That's right. So I turn that on, and now I have individual panels that are reduced in size for each of those subdivisions. Pretty powerful stuff, right? Yeah, Nafi gets it. Nafi finally gets it, right? I told you, trust me. Trust me, it makes sense. So in playing with that, now we can kind of reduce the actual size. We can create window slots that are just on the side of the panel, or we can keep it wide and actually move the lower limits up so that we get sort of a, what's the term for it? I'm forgetting what the term is called. Clear story light. So there's all these things that you can do with this just by creating referential geometry. But for us, we're keeping it pretty simple. I'm not necessarily asking for everything to be very exact. Let me go back to 1 on this. I don't need everything to be super exact, but what I do want to see is that you've gotten it to a point where you've got kind of a significantly, meaty, I guess, bit of geometry within which you can actually just kind of get a feeling that it's a building. It's still a surface. It's not a bunch of sticks, right? So kind of pull it in a little bit so that it gives you that sense. Something like that. Okay, and to clean things up, I like to keep my definitions very linear. I try my best to keep them reading in a linear fashion so that we can follow it along chronologically. So I'm going to take this and move it up in its rightful place so that it makes a little bit more sense to read. I'll move it over there. Okay, does anybody have any questions about that? Yes.
Can you explain real quickly just again how you divided that first surface right before you plugged in the ISO trim into the other ISO trim?
So up to here?
Yes.
All right, so going back to the beginning for a full review here, I guess. Turn everything off. All right, so we have the original surface. Guys, this is recapping everything for you so you understand conceptually. We have the full surface that we did a set one surface, and then I'll turn it on, and now it's referenced in. I know that I want to use isotrim because it subdivides it into individual parts. And to do that, I need to use divide domain squared. It gives me even subdivisions of a reference surface. I will say this, guys. These two go hand in hand a lot. In the world of architecture, we use the typical cadence, standard subdivisions very, very often. It's a great way to simulate something very simple if you don't need to get too down in the trenches of actually designing the subdivisions. Okay, so that gave us this. So then very simply, all we had to do is say, well, I'm going to use the same subdivision and reparametrize it so that instead of breaking it down into further subdivisions, I want it to just reduce. So that's what the reparametrize is doing. It's saying, I'm going to change that to be a domain reduction rather than a domain subdivision.
And the reparametrize is?
Right here. Right click on the S input and go to reparametrize. That is the most difficult thing that you'll have to remember about doing this. Because it's so simple, right? Because it's just isotrim with a divide domain squared. And then it's another isotrim with a construct domain squared. The thing that you're always going to forget is to make sure that your second subdivide surface is going to be reparametrized, or anytime you want to set upper and lower limits.
Okay, so I know that this class is going to, basically go over various different commands, but is there a way to kind of just mess around with it and figure out what nodes kind of go together?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I mean, I know you can do that by looking at the inputs and then trying to figure out what connects.
Mm-hmm. I do it all the time. So the question was, for the sake of the video and anyone who didn't hear, can you just kind of look at a node and figure out how it works? The answer is yes. I would say the more accurate answer is to say sometimes, not all the time. For instance, what is going to be obvious is if I want to do like a magnet that's going to scale things based on how far it is from something else. It's under, I think it's under vector point. It's called closest point, right? So it says it finds the closest point and it gives you certain information, right? So it'll say, P is the points that it's referencing, but most importantly, this D is going to measure the distance from one point to a list of other points. And that's very powerful for saying, I want to scale something based on a domain of the closest point and the farthest point. So the farthest things get scaled up larger and the closest things get scaled smaller. So, you can just try to understand. You'll get better at this with experience. You can't figure it out now. But the hardest part about that, that's the easy part. The hardest part about that is understanding that at the same time, if you're working in 3D, you will probably not know, unless you've learned it from someone, that you have to string together evaluate surface and surface closest point to get that to work.
And that's kind of what I was getting at right there.
Yeah, so you need to do UVP into UV, and it'll give you surface normals. You won't know how to find that until someone teaches you. That's not obvious.
What about definitions of words that it's using in the context of the program?
So I'm trying to train you guys, and guys, heads up in the back. I'm trying to train you guys to read the descriptions because if you're missing just a little bit of information, you can probably find it from what it's telling you. Either the most important one is going to be what the input is asking for. So now that I have, for instance, let me just turn this back on. So I have a bunch of surfaces. You'll see things start to recycle. And so I can go back into deconstruct BREP and I can get all of the other information about all of those surfaces again. If I wanted to, if I wanted to start mapping, and we've done this already, but let's say instead of dropping in a sphere, now I want to create pipes on the edges, right? So if I want to create pipes and you've never used it before, I don't think we've used it in this class yet. So just look at the information that it's asking for. So if I want to create a frame around this that's made out of pipes, all I need to do is kind of drop in this pipe thing and say, oh look, base curve. What information do I have, right? I have the surfaces, which I know I can deconstruct and get faces, edges, vertices. So if I know that I can deconstruct it into edges, all I have to do is pull the edges onto the curves and I get a pipe frame. You kind of understand contextually how to figure out what you need? It gets way easier with experience. It's going to be very, very difficult, and it'll take you a long time to string together connections on your own. But once you get a sense for what information you can deconstruct, it'll be very easy to figure out how to construct new geometry. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Did I overwhelm anyone with that? Yeah. Sorry. I know it sounds really crazy, but I'm telling you, like, when I taught this class the first time, I didn't know the software. I was learning everything I was teaching like the day or two before. It's not that hard to figure out. You just need to sit down and try a few things out. And it'll be frustrating a couple of times, but after you get through a couple of frustrating hang-ups, it's like super easy. The door's open. Okay? So, with that monologue, I'll pause there. Let's take a 15-minute break. Right, I'm going to go easy on you guys here tonight. I'll give you a longer break. 15 minutes, kind of wash out the difficulties here, and we're going to get into some stuff that's really cool.